Hello everyone, welcome to a review video for exam 4 or 5, I believe. Sorry if I'm wrong. This video we're going to be talking about Moore's proof of an external world and generally external world skepticism. So to begin with, just what is external world skepticism? That is the view that we know little to nothing about the external world outside our own minds. So this isn't the view that Descartes takes on. We actually mentioned in class, Descartes is not a skeptic. He thinks he successfully overcomes his doubts later in the Meditations, that we don't specifically read that part. However, most philosophers would read Descartes and think that, they take the skeptical part and they're following and they're on board, and then they think he actually fails with his solution, his full-blown solution to his skepticism. He offers the cogito, which is maybe kind of a solution. Philosophers think that kind of fails in many ways, I guess. So the external world skeptic, this isn't a specific person we read, but it's a kind of just collection of anyone who is convinced by, a lot of it's inspired by Descartes' skepticism. Again, even though Descartes wasn't in that field, a lot of people following him would be quite skeptical of the external world, similar to the way Descartes was. So, again, not a specific person, so when G.E. Moore attacks the external world skeptic, he's not coming for a particular philosopher, he's coming for a group, anyone who believes this. So again, we know little to nothing about the external world outside our own minds. And the most modern version of the skeptical scenario, maybe you can think of it as like a modern play on the evil demon hypothesis, that is the brain in the vat hypothesis. So it's slightly different. I guess maybe importantly, it's atheistic or agnostic rather than having some kind of theist implications, but that is the hypothesis that I am a brain in a vat being fed vivid experiences by a mad scientist's supercomputer. So in this scenario, it's not quite as comprehensive as the evil demon, but it's pretty close. So in this scenario, you can certainly doubt that you have a body. In fact, if it's true that you're a brain in a vat, you don't have a body. So if it's a possible skeptical scenario that you're a brain in a vat, you can doubt that you have a body. And then you can pretty much doubt anything that you think you know about the external world. So in the brain in the vat hypothesis, maybe there is some kind of material world. I mean, there's this supercomputer, there's maybe the mad scientist, there's your brain, there's a technology, I guess. But this is pretty much unknowable to you. And anything in the external world, anything that we would ordinarily take to be the external world, this pen, this paper, this laptop, so on and so on, is actually not the external world. So maybe it's there, but it's unknowable to us, and again, everything that we think to be the external world isn't. And we can actually know little to nothing about what the external world actually is outside our own minds. And we can certainly doubt that we have a body at all in this hypothesis. It may seem to us so, like it seems to this in this graphic that it seems to this brain that they're a person walking. None of that is in fact true. So the argument for external world skepticism, again, kind of inspired by Descartes, but different, using the brain in a vat hypothesis. The first premise is, if I know I have hands, then I know I'm not a brain in a vat. And you can just defend this premise. To do it, we reference this principle called the closure principle. Broadly, the closure principle is, if you know that P entails Q, then if you know that P, you also know Q. So we talk about the Mike and Ike case. Mike and Ike are two identical twins. Say you see one of these twins on campus and you go, that's Mike. I know that's Mike. And then someone next to you goes, oh, you know that's Mike, so you must know that's not Ike. And you're like, no, I don't know it's not Ike. I mean, they're hard to tell apart, and I don't have a way to tell them apart, actually. But I do know it's Mike. That makes no sense, of course. The person you're talking to would be like, well, if you don't know that's Ike, certainly you don't know it's Mike. That is because you could sub in P for maybe the proposition, that guy is Mike, entails the proposition Q, that guy isn't Ike. Because they're two different people, of course. Me being the fact that I'm Jade entails that I'm not my brother or my sister. That's just true. We're different people. And then, therefore, if you know that P entails Q, then if you know P, you also know Q. So relating this back to the external world skeptic premise, having hands entails not being a brain in a vat. So that's a different premise than what we see here. But that premise could just be, if I have hands, I'm not a brain in a vat. Again, that's almost just kind of like definitionally true. Maybe not definitionally true, but obviously true. If I have hands, then I'm not a brain in a vat. Obviously, of course. There's no way to even really like refute that. That's like, what do you mean? But we need to get to the claim, if I know I have hands, then I know I'm not a brain in a vat. So the difference between those two premises, it is subtle. Really, one is just adding the antecedent I know to both sides of the conditional. But it does make a difference, and we need to explain why that jump is justified. So having hands entails not being a brain in a vat, obviously. Thus, if you know you have hands, then you know you're not a brain in a vat. So if one entails the other, then if you know one, you know the other. Again, it's pretty simple and probably pretty intuitive. You can think about this for like pretty much any case. If I know this pencil is completely black, then I know there's no pink on it or whatever. I mean, that's you could really think of any example, and usually they can be pretty obvious, almost annoyingly obvious. But really, just to think of it as like the closure principle is jumping from a claim about truth to a claim about what you know, and that's the important difference there. And then think back to the Mike and Ike case maybe for how exactly that works. So the second premise, I don't know, I'm not a brain in a vat. And the skeptic offers a more complete argument for defending this premise. So that is, I know I'm not a brain in a vat only if I have evidence that guarantees I'm not a brain in a vat. I don't have evidence that guarantees I'm not a brain in a vat. Therefore, I don't know I'm not a brain in a vat. So maybe that's more simple, but it goes back to the guarantee principle. So I only know I'm not if I have evidence that can guarantee with certainty that I'm not. Am I certain that I'm not a brain in a vat? In other words, can I think of a possible skeptical scenario in which I am a brain in a vat or a scenario to be skeptical over whether or not I am a brain in a vat? The answer is yes, and that is the brain in the vat hypothesis. That's a possible skeptical scenario. And because that scenario is a possibility, you cannot guarantee that you are not a brain in a vat. So again, I only know I'm not a brain in a vat if I have evidence that guarantees I'm not. Because knowledge is, so Descartes thinks, at least, and this is where the Descartes' influence maybe comes into the external world skepticism argument. Descartes thinks the dividing line between belief and knowledge is certainty or guarantee. So how do we distinguish a mere belief from knowing something? It's that everything we know, we're certain of, and we have evidence to guarantee that it's true. It's not that way for our beliefs. I could say, I believe that manifesting in my journal will make whatever I manifest come true. I guess you could say that with any sort of spirituality. I believe that praying to the gods will be the cause of good consequences. Those are beliefs, and even people who believe those might say they don't know, or at least a lot of people around them who don't subscribe to those same beliefs will say you believe it, but you don't know it because you don't have evidence that can guarantee it. Not to get religiously controversial, I suppose, and you don't need to think too deeply into that, but really just think of the dividing between a mere belief and knowledge, and for Descartes, that is certainty. So that's the argument for external world skepticism. Again, this is not one philosopher in particular, but this is how G.E. Moore is thinking about his opponent, maybe. That's one way to think of it. So, G.E. Moore, it's obviously in his paper, he makes it pretty clear that he really disagrees with the external world skeptic, and he wants to provide an argument to prove why the external world skepticism argument is wrong. So this is called Moore's proof. This is an argument that we labeled Moore's proof. The first premise, I have two hands. Defense, here is a hand, here is another hand. I can do this with them. They can hold things like a pencil. They're here. I have them. They're here. I have two hands. Here you go. That's a defense of that one. Moore's proof 2, if I have two hands, then there's an external world. We don't go over a specific defense of this, but one thing you don't really need to know is, but one thing you could think of is, well, obviously, my hands are part of it. If, and Moore even says, like, I could do this ad infinitum with every part of the external world. Like, I have legs. Here they are. I could point to them too. There's a pencil here. Here it is. That's my proof. Here it is. I have it. I've defended that point. So there's an external world. My hands are part of it, and really everything's part of it. Everything you could possibly hold up, do that same proof that you just did with the hands thing, that's also part of it. So my hands are part of the external world. I can't possibly be a handless brain in a vat, or a spirit, a non-material spirit being controlled by an evil demon, or any other skeptical scenario, because I have hands and they're in the external world. Therefore, there is an external world. So I think people, maybe when they hear this, maybe after just spending too much time with Descartes and the skeptic, are a little hesitant to be convinced by this. So maybe you're convinced already. Totally fair. However, the skeptic still has more to say. The skeptic is angry. The skeptic is like, no more. You can't just say that. You can't do that. We, the skeptics, have provided an argument for external world skepticism where the conclusion is, I don't know I have hands. I've proved that. I've proven that already. So you can't just say, I have two hands. We already ran through this argument that says you don't know that you don't know that you have hands, or I don't know that I have hands. So you need to prove why my argument isn't sound. You need to offer a reply to the argument for external world skepticism before you even try to offer another theory using using conflicting or using other statements that conflict with what I just said. So, and Moore's like, okay, I will. I'm not done. I'll reply to the skeptic. And this is a reminder, this is the argument for external world skepticism. And Moore's like, okay, I just need to prove that this is unsound in some way. So I can, because Moore disagrees with this, therefore I don't know I have hands, clearly disagrees with that. So he needs to provide some reason as to why this argument is unsound. And this is his target, the second premise of external world skepticism. That is, I don't know, I'm not a brain in a vat. He's like, okay, you're saying I don't know, I'm not a brain in a vat. I'll show you that you know you're not a brain in a vat. Yeah, he disagrees with that. That's his target. That's what he comes for. So, and this is Moore's reply, different from Moore's proof. But here he mentions, so this is how his reply goes. He says, if I know I have hands, then I know I'm not a brain in a vat. So defense here, the skeptic already defended this premise with the closure principle. Think back to the closure principle. There's an argument outlined to defend that premise. They use the closure principle. So we already, the skeptic, the skeptic agrees with this already, and it's pretty obvious to us too. So there's no disagreement here so far. Skeptic's on board. And then Moore says, I know I have hands. His defense, here's a hand, here's another hand. And again, he's doing the same thing. It's just like, and the skeptic at this point, they're like, I already disagree with you. But nonetheless, the conclusion of this argument is, therefore, I know I'm not a brain in a vat. Therefore, your second premise is false. I've shown you that, actually, I do know I'm not a brain in a vat. So you can think of this maybe as the Uno reverse card, if you guys have ever heard that before as like a joke. He's pulling the Uno reverse card, he's just kind of like, but you. He's doing the same thing, giving it right back to him, exactly how it's dished to him. So, and the defense for I know I have hands, he goes, here's a hand, here's another hand. Do you know that with certainty? Does Moore even think that he knows that with certainty? Maybe not, but Moore does say, I know that I have two hands with more certainty than I know any premise of the argument for external world skepticism. So Moore's like, maybe I can't be certain of any of this, maybe not, but I'm certainly more certain that I have hands than some like weird philosophical argument that I had never heard of nor thought of till Intro to Philosophy, when some, random professor put it in my face and made me think about it. I've gone my whole life, pretty certain that I have hands. And then after I heard your argument, Mr. Skeptic, I forgot about it. I went home, I left philosophy class, I went home, I went to bed, and, I stopped thinking about it, like most of you probably did. And I went on, again, pretty certain that I have hands. So, no, maybe you're not certain of anything, but I am more certain of this compared to this weird philosophical theory. So for Moore, common sense beats out a strange, airy philosophical theory that goes against everything we would have ordinarily thought. So that's Moore's reply. Know the difference between Moore's proof and Moore's reply? You can really just think of it by first maybe thinking of what prompts Moore's reply. Again, they're pretty similar arguments, but for testing purposes, you should know the difference pretty well. So think about how the reply is prompted by the skeptic saying, you need to reject one of my premises, and Moore comes for this one, and then he offers his reply. You're not going to be tested on this because we didn't exactly finish the last portion of the notes where it says question begging and then where it says 2 ways to understand Moore's goal. If it's helpful, I'll go over that briefly. The question begging is, if you guys remember, question begging from the first unit we did. A question begging argument is an argument whose premises inappropriately assume the truth of the conclusion. And the question is whether or not Moore is question begging. You don't even need to think about that too much because you're not going to be tested on it, but I would encourage you, if you're skeptical of Moore's argument in his proof or his reply, to try to figure out where the question begging is. That would be an interesting thing to really think about. And then if you find where it is, think about whether or not the external world skeptic is any better in that regard, or are they just question begging the same way? And then maybe you'll just be kind of confused, but like, wait a minute, actually, like, they're both question begging. Or maybe you'll come to find that you don't think either of them are question begging. You don't have to think about that, but that's just one thing to consider. So this is something Dr. Barker touched on in his explanation, but last part of the notes, it says, there are 2 ways to understand Moore's goal. And again, I don't believe you'll be tested on this, but in case you're curious. So it lists offensive. You could understand him as providing an offensive argument. This would mean that he's trying to convince the skeptic. So he's putting forth an argument that he thinks will convince anyone who doesn't already agree with him. The question is whether or not Moore even thought that he was convincing any skeptic with this argument. The answer is probably no. Moore was probably pretty aware that this argument would not persuade any skeptic to come to the anti-skeptical side. So that's one way, and then maybe you think he fails in that realm. However, maybe a more charitable way of understanding Moore's goal is defensive. So this would be to show that the skeptic's own belief in the external world, or the belief in the external world that they probably held before they even became a skeptic, isn't irrational or baseless. So I think honestly another question is, I've never met an external world skeptic. Dr. Barker also said he hasn't either, even in the realm of philosophy. And I honestly think that even if I did meet an external world skeptic, I'm not sure that I would be fully convinced that they even fully believe what they say. Just because we function so ordinarily under the assumption of an external world, and they presumably do too, that maybe they think philosophically they can't prove it, but to me it kind of seems like they have some kind of belief in the external world, even if they can't prove it with certainty, and they really believe they can't prove it with certainty. And maybe they believe that means they don't know it. So defensive would be to show that, if you are the skeptic, whatever belief you do have, you may have whatever lingering belief you have in the possibility of an external world isn't irrational or baseless. There's something there. So yeah, you don't exactly need to know that, but if it helps, and of course the defensive side, that's probably more accurate to Moore's goal and maybe a more charitable way of understanding what's going on. So yeah, the test will be in class at the time I'm recording this tomorrow. And yeah, let me know if you guys have any questions, and thank you for watching.